Welcome to our second lecture, in which we will be deciding what we make of the Renaissance in Florence. Was it a period? Was it a movement? Was it, as John Green puts it, even a thing? So, the very term Renaissance implies that there must have been a birth, a death, and a rebirth, a concept which, for millennia, has appealed to sacred and secular thinkers on, well, a global scale. From India to Iberia, the notion of cyclical existence has always been with us. So, how have we, at least the general public and a good swath of historians, over the past 2 centuries, come to so fully embrace the notion that there was this thing called the Renaissance, that it happened in the 15th century, and that Florence was its birthplace? Um, the better we understand why the Renaissance, couched in this way, has so enraptured Western civilization, the better we will understand why the ensuing centuries have been so overlooked, so forgotten. This lecture is divided into 3 parts. In the first, we'll examine the various ways historians have envisioned the Renaissance since Jules Michelet first wrote a book about it in 1855. So we'll examine the historiography of the Renaissance. Next, we'll try to understand why great thinkers, since Petrarch, thought that the centuries before Florence in the 1300s were characterized by destruction, disorder, and darkness. And we'll see how much evidence there actually is for such a synopsis, and what kinds of historical developments might lead us to see the Middle Ages in a different light. Finally, we'll take a look at Renaissance people, pedagogy, and patronage in Florence. Figuring prominently in this section will be, of course, the Medici. We'll take a look at 2 Medici figures whom we were introduced last week, Cosimo Pater Patriae and Lorenzo il Magnifico, the Magnificent. We'll see what they did to be honored with such titles. So let's turn now to the historiography of the Renaissance. When one speaks of the Renaissance in Italy, one is almost duty-bound to mention Jacob Burckhardt and his classic work, The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy. Although much challenged, and despite the fact that I heartily disagree with many of Burckhardt's conclusions, I think it is still an interesting read. Burckhardt was of Swiss nationality. He lived in, let's say, turbulent times. So by the time he sat down to write his now famous account of the birth of the modern world and the emergence of the individual, he would have witnessed successive revolutions across Europe, basically the metastatic expansion of European empires in Africa and globally. And by the time that his work, The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy, was published in 1860, Burckhardt would have witnessed the opening years of the great political unification of Italy, in which the extremely lauded military leader Garibaldi swept down the peninsula with a group of about, they say, 1,000 volunteers, subdued Sicily, and then booted out all the foreign rulers, that you see here, who had for centuries kept Italy in their grasp. The 19th century was really the great age of isms, imperialism, nationalism, and individualism, if you like. So it's no wonder that much of Burckhardt's language in The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy is about tyranny on one side, and on the other, democratic challenges to that tyranny. So as you'll see in the Alison Brown chapters we're reading for this week, the very notion of the Renaissance as a clearly definable period, which begins in Florence and encapsulates a revolution in politics, art, and philosophy, was very much shaped by the concerns and experiences of 19th century historians, who essentially saw parallels with their own time. It's important to note, too, that Burckhardt's writings on the Renaissance, like many of the scholars who came after him, was very much influenced by Giorgio Vasari's Lives of the Artist, which we will also be reading this week. A good deal after Burckhardt, going into the 20th century, particularly after World War II, successive waves of historians took issue with his all-encompassing reading of modernity in Renaissance Italy, his characterization of the church and other rulers as despotic, and in the secularizing effect he saw in the Renaissance. Historians of social history have asked about the scope of the Renaissance. So, how are we supposed to understand its impact? Was it only limited to elites? Joan Kelly's now famous article, Did Women Have a Renaissance?, which we'll be reading for next week on our section on gender, was highly critical of Burckhardt and his ilk. So the end result is that the study of the Renaissance has become very meta. So there are resurgences of study of the Renaissance and what it actually was, who took part, also in a very cyclical pattern. So a lot of the trouble about thinking about the Renaissance, particularly as a period of cultural explosion after dark ages of nothing much interesting happening, started with that quote from Petrarch, Francesco Petrarca, in Italian, which roughly translated is, amidst the errors, there shone forth men of genius. No less keen were their eyes, although they were surrounded by darkness and dense gloom. So Petrarch was a keen historian and poet. He was a scholar whose rediscovery of the letters of Roman Republican Cicero had enduring impact on the study of the humanities. His own study of classical works led him to believe that the golden age of civilization lay with the Romans and the Greeks, and that the period which came after, a period in which he was living, having been born in 1304, was still one of enduring darkness. There were signs of hope, of course, of men, geniuses like himself, or his contemporary Dante, Alighieri. These signs seemed to augur the dawn of a new age. Himself having lived through the first visitation of the Black Death in 1347 and the successive decades of instability that it brought, one can understand why Petrarch considered himself a light in the darkness. So the problem lies in the way that Petrarch's assertion that the period we now call the Middle Ages was one of disorder and darkness it really lies in the way it's been used by historians and the general public to see Italy and Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire and before the rise of city-states such as Florence as part of a dark ages. So let's take a closer look and broaden our concept of the Renaissance and of rebirth. First, it is important to consider that across Europe, in successive centuries, centers of new learning and cultural efflorescence emerged. Consider for just a moment what we may call the Northumbrian Renaissance, or the Northumbrian Golden Age, or Northumbria's Golden Age, more traditionally known. During this period, so roughly the 7th and 8th centuries, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria experienced a burst of cultural production centered around sacred learning. The great English historian, the Venerable Bede, was a leading participant in the Northumbrian rebirth, as was Alcuin of York, who in the late 8th century would lead the Carolingian Renaissance at Charlemagne's court at Aachen. As part of this Carolingian Renaissance, Charlemagne invited leading scholars and learned men to his court, where they promoted the study and refinement of Latin, and they also trained priests in the language in order that they might read the Vulgate and actually be able to execute their duties as priests. The Carolingian court patronized arts and architects, meaning that the 9th century witnessed a revival in large-scale building and in the output of many illuminated manuscripts and also Gothic art. Now, jumping ahead, while not directly covered in this class, it's also crucial not to underestimate the influence of the Northern Renaissance, which would also take place in the 15th century, where from Bruges, such artists as Jan van Eyck would revolutionize the painting techniques of the period. Though he was not technically the first person to do so, Van Eyck used oil paints and a sort of layering of lacquers to give a sensation of depth and vibrancy to his paintings. Oil really gives a visceral pull to his work that tempera, which is a paint based upon a mixture of pigment with egg yolk as a fixative, that was used in works of earlier artists like Cimabue and Giotto lacked. So it really didn't have the same capacity to deliver color and texture and depth that oil does. But returning to our Dark Ages, plenty of economic, social, and political developments were stimulating the minds and activities of people across Europe. One of the most important drivers of cultural and commercial exchange was the vast networks of trade that, via land or water, linked Italy and Europe with faraway lands. Medieval fairs and bazaars were quite a bit more varied in their offerings than one might think. So if we take a quick glance at the trade routes which linked Asia and Anatolia and the Mediterranean, here you can see that while the Northumbrian Renaissance was in full flower in the 8th century, all of this exchange in the Mediterranean, linking Asia essentially with England, if we want, was taking place, whether it was via galley ship or on the back of a camel, covering the caravan routes across what is now the Middle East. So these networks continued to flourish into the 13th and early 14th centuries. And the variety of goods traded continues to diversify. In medieval Europe, this transnational exchange encouraged the growth of fair towns and principal centers of exchange. As we can see from our map here, Florence was only one of these. But already by the early 14th century, Florentine bankers were thriving. They were present at many of the northern fairs to lend money, always keeping a careful note of their transactions in a double entry system of bookkeeping. So we can see here some of the towns that are holding fairs. Principal commercial centers are in black, of which you can see Florence is one of them. Also Pisa, Genoa, which were also had substantial maritime empires of their own. So in fact, the florin becomes the currency of choice in the Middle Ages. As we can see here, it's made out of gold. It's stamped on one side with the fleur-de-lis, which is the symbol of Florence, and on the other side it has St. John the Baptist, who is the city's patron saint. The longevity of the popularity of this coin really can't be overstated. A rather less equitable form of cross-cultural exchange came in the form of the Crusades, beginning in 1095. As successive waves of Europeans came rampaging, let's say, across the Holy Land, for a time even succeeding in setting up regional kingdoms, displaced artists made their way to the European continent looking for work. of a map of the successive European crusades. So this causes great displacement of philosophers, artists, highly learned people, who then, in certain cases, make their way over to the European continent. They brought not only the Byzantine style of painting with them, which is a form which would be very widespread, especially, predominantly in church art, until the innovations of Cimabue and Giotto, who you'll read about in Vasari. But aside from the impact on art, returning crusaders also brought back other things, religious relics, sacred texts, as well as rediscovered classical works, some of them which had been plundered from the libraries of scholarly Muslims. So it's crucial to keep in mind that as the great Islamic empires spread outwards from the Arabian Peninsula from the 8th century onwards, they encouraged a growth in the number and size of new centers of trade, but also centers of learning. So the Abbasid Caliphate became a great, really thriving center of learning, as Muslim scholars there, under the patronage of the Caliphate, translated the works of Aristotle, Galen, and numerous other Greek philosophers from Greek into Arabic. In the Iberian dominion of Al-Andalus, Muslim rulers hosted such brilliant philosophers as Averroes and Avicenna. As sections of the Iberian Peninsula were gradually retaken by Christian forces, more Europeans came to study at the famous libraries and repositories of learning of the former caliphate. So it was there, in the Iberian Peninsula, in the late Middle Ages, that many Christian scholars encountered the classic works of Greek and Roman philosophers and thinkers, allowing for a real rediscovery and rebirth. Really not only in philosophy, but also in mathematics, medicine, geometry, architecture. The list goes on and on. Even Fibonacci, who brought the mathematical sequence that now bears his name, the Fibonacci sequence, back to Italy. He was the son of a merchant of Pisa who emigrated to North Africa, and the young Leonardo Bonacci, that's his proper name, learned his numbers at a Muslim madrasa school. So as this wealth of classical learning became diffused across the continent, Christian philosophers struggled to harmonize the teachings of classical Greece with Christian thought. Some models, such as Ptolemy's geocentric view of the cosmos, they squared very nicely with the teachings of the Bible. Some other viewpoints, however, particularly Aristotle's views on the nature of the soul, were considered so heretical that they were banned from being taught in the universities, these guilds of qualified scholars that were now popping up across Europe. One man, however, the 13th century Italian monk Thomas Aquinas, was hailed as having succeeded where others had failed. In his Summa Theologica, he is able to really meld classical and Christian learning by drawing selectively, very selectively, not only from Plato, Cicero, and Aristotle, but also from Hebrew and Muslim scholars, such as Avicenna and Averroes, to argue for the ineffability of the Christian God. And the work itself was intended to be a sort of instructional manual for clergy and for Christian scholars who came after him, those who would teach at the ever more numerous Christian universities across the continent. And here we have Thomas Aquinas confounding Averroes. It's pretty self-explanatory, but suffice to say that Muslim learning is being projected as inferior.